The Winchester rifle's report shatters the afternoon silence across the sun-scorched prairie, sending shock waves through the superheated air, like the crack of divine judgment. The bullet tears through their water barrel, with the sound of ripping canvas precious liquid cascading onto the drought-hardened earth in a mockery of the rain that hasn't fallen in 6 weeks. Felix Bennett's 6-year-old heart hammers against his ribs like a caged sparrow, each beat so violent he can feel it in his throat. His breath comes in sharp little gasps that sound almost like hiccups, and tears stream down his dust-streaked cheeks as he presses himself against the wagon wheel with desperate intensity. The rough wood splinters dig into his palms, but the pain is nothing compared to the terror that makes his whole body shake like a leaf in a hurricane. "Mama, mama, mama." He whispers over and over the words, barely audible above the thunder of approaching hoofbeats that seem to shake the very ground beneath them. His voice cracks with the kind of fear that comes from understanding, even at 6 years old, that some adults mean to hurt children, and that his mother might not be able to stop them. Hazel Bennett's world narrows to a single desperate thought that consumes her entire being: my babies. Dear God, I have to protect my babies. At 28, she has already buried one husband and lost one home to the relentless cruelty of frontier life. But the idea of losing Nora and Felix feels like staring into an abyss that would swallow not just her life, but her very soul. Her calloused hands shake as she scrambles for Arthur's old Colt revolver beneath the driver's seat, her fingers slipping twice on the smooth wooden handle. The metallic taste of pure terror coats her tongue like copper pennies, and she can feel her heart beating so hard it might burst from her chest. The gun feels impossibly heavy in her grip, its weight multiplied by the knowledge that everything she loves in this world depends on what happens in the next few heartbeats. "Stay behind the wheel, both of you." She commands, her voice somehow steady, despite the earthquake of fear rattling through every bone in her body. "Whatever happens, you keep your heads down and you don't move until I tell you it's safe." Nora's 10-year-old eyes blaze with protective fury that belongs on a much older face as she wraps her thin arms around Felix's trembling form. Her jaw is set with the kind of determination that has been passed down through generations of frontier women who learned early that survival meant fighting for those too small to fight for themselves. "I won't let them hurt him, Mama," she declares with fierce conviction that would be heartbreaking if it weren't so necessary. "I promise you that. They'll have to go through me first." Hazel raises the heavy revolver with both hands, trying to control the trembling that threatens to make any shot impossible. She squeezes the trigger with all her strength. The hammer falls with a hollow click that might as well be a death sentence echoing across the wasteland. Empty. The chamber is empty, and she has no time to reload. From the ridge above, another rifle shot cracks across the desolation like a whip. Dusty Bill's hat spins away in a spray of sweat and sudden panic as his horse rears, nearly throwing him from the saddle. A broad-shouldered Apache warrior slides down the rocky slope with liquid grace, his long black hair streaming behind him like a war banner, as he moves with the deadly precision of a mountain cat. Hakan navigates the treacherous terrain like flowing water, his 35 years of survival instincts reading every angle and shadow with the kind of awareness that separates the living from the dead in Apache country. His weathered face shows no emotion as he lands in a perfect crouch beside their broken wagon. But his dark eyes missed nothing, the panic blazing in Hazel's green gaze, the terror radiating from the children like heat from a forge. The professional way the two gunmen are repositioning themselves for another assault. The acrid scent of gunpowder hangs heavy in the still air, mixing with the smell of fear sweat and the metallic tang of blood from where a bullet fragment has nicked Hazel's forearm. The horses snort and paw nervously at the ground, their iron shoes striking sparks against the rocks as they sense the violence crackling in the atmosphere like electricity before a thunderstorm. But these men aren't common bandits looking for easy money. Hakan says quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who has seen death in all its forms and learned to read the signs that others miss. "They're hunting you specifically, Hazel Bennett. This is personal business." She recognizes his voice like a song from a half-remembered dream, and the sound carrying her back 10 years through memory and heartache to flood swollen waters and 2 days that changed everything she thought she knew about love and loss. Her breath catches in her throat as recognition floods through her, bringing with it a complex mixture of relief, confusion, and emotions she thought she had buried with Arthur. Hakan. She breathes the name, carrying a weight of memory that threatens to overwhelm her, even in this moment of mortal danger. "You came back. After all these years, you actually came back." The two riders have wheeled their mounts in a wide arc, Dusty Bill clutching his bleeding scalp while Quiet Will raises his rifle for another shot. They're professional killers who understand the value of patience. Men who know that cornered prey eventually makes the mistakes that get them killed. Their movements are coordinated, methodical, speaking of experience in this kind of deadly work. Hakan checks his Winchester with economical movements, counting cartridges with fingers that never tremble. His voice remains steady as granite as he speaks, without taking his eyes off the circling riders. "These children deserve to see tomorrow's sunrise. Let me help you make sure they do. I never really left." He adds his words, somehow reaching her heart despite the chaos erupting around them. Some promises take longer to keep than others, but that doesn't make them less sacred. April 15th, 1879. 3 weeks before the bullets started flying and blood began to soak into the prairie soil, before the flames and the flood and the revelations that would shatter everything Hazel thought she knew about her life. She had been a different woman, facing what seemed like manageable problems. The homestead near Prairie Rose stretched across 40 acres of stubborn earth, where she and Arthur had built their dreams one fence post at a time, one season of backbreaking labor after another. Every irrigation channel they had dug by hand, every section of fence they had raised against the wind, every room they had added to their modest cabin represented years of sacrifice and hope invested in a future they were building for their children. Arthur Bennett's death in the Copper Gulch mine explosion had been swift but utterly devastating, taking with it not just her beloved husband, but the entire foundation of everything they had worked to build together. The blast that killed him on that terrible April morning had triggered an avalanche of legal and financial disasters that threatened to bury her family under an insurmountable mountain of debt and carefully orchestrated deception. Victor Blackthorne was a man who wore respectability, like expensive cologne, pleasant and impressive on the surface, but concealing something fundamentally rotten underneath. He had arrived from Philadelphia with substantial financial backing, political connections, and a smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. His visit to her cabin 3 days after Arthur's funeral had been a masterpiece of false sympathy wrapped around a core of pure, predatory calculation. "My dear Mrs. Bennett," he had said, removing his expensive hat with theatrical courtesy, while his pale eyes catalogued every valuable item in her modest home. "Please allow me to express how deeply sorry I am for your tragic and untimely loss." Arthur was, well, he was a man who understood the true value of ambition in this territory, shall we say. Hazel had felt her heart beginning to sink, even before he continued, recognizing the tone of a man delivering bad news with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. His cultured accent and expensive clothes couldn't disguise the cold calculation in his eyes as he spread legal documents across her kitchen table like a card sharp dealing a crooked hand. "I'm afraid there are certain financial obligations that his unfortunate death has brought to light." Blackthorne continued with mock sadness. "Substantial debts that must be satisfied regardless of personal circumstances or emotional attachments to this property. The water rights to Willow Springs represented everything Arthur had worked toward: the promise of green fields and full irrigation channels of crops that would feed their children and grandchildren for generations to come. But Blackthorn's copper operation consumed water like a mechanical beast, consuming prey, requiring millions of gallons for ore processing steam engines, and the kind of industrial operations that generated enormous profits for men who cared nothing about the families they destroyed in pursuit of wealth. Surely there must be some mistake. Hazel had protested, her hands clutching Arthur's carefully preserved promissory notes and wage receipts with the desperate intensity of a drowning woman grasping for driftwood. He was earning excellent wages from your mine, more than enough to cover any reasonable debts with money left over for our family's needs. Blackthorn's smile had widened, then revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for a man who claimed to work alongside common miners. "Ah, but you see, my dear widow, industrial accidents have a way of complicating business matters. Records are lost in fires. Witnesses develop uncertain memories about previous arrangements. It's the unfortunate nature of frontier business, I'm afraid, so much more precarious than the civilized commerce of eastern cities." The threat had been delivered with such casual cruelty that Hazel felt it like a physical blow to her chest, leaving her struggling to breathe as she looked through her kitchen window at Nora and Felix playing in the dirt outside their cabin. She realized with crystalline clarity that this man would destroy them all without losing a moment's sleep over the consequences, that he saw her family as nothing more than obstacles to be cleared away in pursuit of his larger ambitions. What she didn't know then, what she wouldn't discover until much later, was that Arthur's signature on those promissory notes had been obtained through direct threats against his family's safety. Blackthorn's men had cornered him in the mine office one evening after his shift ended, when the other workers had gone home to their suppers and their wives and their own problems. "Sign the papers, Bennett," Greasy Pete had said, pressing the sharp edge of a skinning knife against Arthur's throat, while Dusty Bill stood guard at the door with his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Or we pay a social visit to that pretty wife of yours and them two little ones. Maybe teach them some lessons about what happens to families that don't cooperate with legitimate business enterprises." Arthur had signed those documents knowing that his family's immediate safety depended on his compliance, never imagining that his own death was already part of Blackthorn's carefully orchestrated long-term plan. The mining accident that killed him had been no accident at all, but a deliberately orchestrated execution designed to eliminate the one witness who could testify to the coercion and fraud that formed the foundation of Blackthorn's empire. Finn O'Rourke understood the crushing weight of Hazel's situation because he carried similar burdens on his own bent and weathered shoulders. The Irish farmer had arrived in the territory 15 years earlier with nothing but determination, a willingness to work 18-hour days in soil that fought him for every seed and memories of the old country that made him understand exactly what men like Blackthorn represented. I know the type well enough," he said when Hazel explained her situation, his County Cork accent thick with memories of landlords and evictions of entire families destroyed by men in expensive suits who signed papers that meant starvation for whole communities. "They come to our new country with their fine clothes and their university manners, thinking they can buy and sell honest working folk like livestock at the county fair." His weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped her load supplies into his spare wagon, but his blue eyes burned with the kind of righteous anger that had driven his ancestors to fight impossible odds against impossible enemies. "But they're forgetting something important, Mrs. Bennett. We didn't survive the ocean crossing and the wilderness and the fever and the Indians and all the rest of it just to roll over for the likes of them when they come calling with their legal papers and their threats." He pressed a small leather pouch into her palm, and the contents clinking softly with the sound of silver coins earned through backbreaking labor and careful saving. "Take this for your expenses, and don't be arguing with me about it. My Mary would box my ears if she knew I let a widow travel without proper funds." Documentation and witnesses stand up in territorial court even when a widow's voice gets lost in all the shouting and legal maneuvering. As she climbed onto the wagon seat with Nora and Felix beside her, Finn caught her arm with surprising gentleness for such work-hardened hands. "There's something else you should be knowing, lass. Word around the trading posts is that Blackthorn's got more than simple greed driving him these days. He's got debts of his own back east, big debts to the kind of men who don't accept excuses or delays or promises of future payment. He needs that water for his processing operation. But he also needs it quick-like before his creditors come calling with their own kind of justice." Miles away from Hazel's desperate preparations following ancient game trails that wound through pine-covered ridges like serpents threading through Eden, Hakan tracked rumors that made his warrior's blood run cold as mountain snow. The Apache telegraph of trading post gossip campfire conversations and the kind of information that traveled faster than horses or telegraph wires had carried word of a red-haired widow being systematically harassed over water rights near Willow Springs. Each detail struck him like physical blows, confirming what his heart already knew with terrible certainty. The description of the woman auburn hair that caught sunlight like flame-green eyes, that blazed with fierce determination and a devotion to her children, that bordered on the sacred matched his memories of 1869 with painful precision. He had been 25, then she barely 18 when the flash flood trapped them together in Owl Canyon for 2 days and nights that had changed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. They had shared stories beneath star-filled skies, dreams of futures that seemed possible when spoken aloud in the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. "I want my children to grow up free," she had told him on that second night, her voice soft with dreams and possibilities, as they sat by their small fire, listening to the floodwaters rushing past in the darkness. Free to choose their own paths, free to love who they choose, free to be judged by their actions instead of their bloodlines or the circumstances of their birth. The Apache believed children belonged to the whole tribe. He had replied, building up their fire against the night's chill, while trying not to think about how beautiful she looked in the firelight. Every adult has a responsibility to protect and teach every child, regardless of blood relations. Your dreams sound like Apache dreams to me. Before they parted, when the floodwaters finally receded, he had given her a pair of turquoise beads carved with traditional symbols of protection and connection. One bore his name carefully scratched in English letters, a promise to return when the world allowed such meetings between their peoples. The other was meant for her to keep a token of bonds that transcended the cultural divisions that kept their worlds separate. He still carried his matching bead worn smooth by a decade of handling during quiet moments when memory overwhelmed the present. The small stone had become a talisman of hope and regret, a reminder of the road not taken, and the woman who had shown him that understanding could exist between worlds that most people believed were destined for eternal conflict. Now, hearing her name connected with violence and systematic oppression, he felt those old promises stirring in his chest like coals stirred to flame by a sudden wind. The Apache concept of honor demanded that debts be paid and protection extended to those who had shared food and fire and dreams beneath the same stars, regardless of how much time had passed or how much the world had changed. The trail that led him toward Willow Springs was marked by signs that spoke of desperation and flight-broken wagon wheel ruts, cut deep into the hardpan scattered belongings that spoke of hasty packing, and the tracks of horses ridden hard by men who cared nothing for their mounts' welfare. Professional killers left different signs than casual bandits, and Hakan could read the story of systematic pursuit and carefully planned violence in every hoof print and bullet scar on the rocks. The confrontation at Willow Springs had erupted like summer lightning, sudden, violent, and illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadow for far too long. Greasy Pete had arrived with Blackthorn's ultimatum disguised as legal documentation, his pockmarked face gleaming with the kind of malicious satisfaction that came from holding absolute power over the helpless. "Got some important paperwork that needs your immediate attention, widow woman." He had announced dismounting from his lathered horse with theatrical ceremony, while his companions remained mounted and ready. Dusty Bill and Quiet Will were professional gunmen who understood the tactical value of proper positioning, their hands resting casually on weapon grips, while their experienced eyes cataloged escape routes and potential fields of fire. The documents Pete presented were impressive forgeries bearing official seals and formal legal language. But their message was simple extortion wrapped in territorial statutes and civil procedures. Arthur's employment records had been unfortunately destroyed in an accidental fire at the mine office. His accumulated wages were declared forfeit due to his breach of contract through premature death. The Bennett family's claim to Willow Springs water rights was ruled improperly documented, without proper territorial registration and witness verification. Of course, we're all reasonable men here. Pete had continued, his pale eyes fixing on Nora and Felix with the kind of predatory interest that made every maternal instinct in Hazel's body flare like struck matches. Might be we could work out some alternative arrangements that would benefit all parties concerned. Them children could earn steady wages in town, paying off the family debt through honest labor in our various business enterprises. The suggestion hung in the superheated air like smoke from a signal fire, carrying implications that made Hazel's blood freeze in her veins, even as her heart began to beat faster with a mother's primal rage. She stepped protectively in front of her children, every muscle in her body tensing for the kind of desperate action that mothers had been taking since the dawn of human civilization. That was when Hakan emerged from the sagebrush, like a warrior spirit given flesh and deadly purpose. His presence radiated the quiet authority of a man who had never learned to compromise with evil. His dark eyes measuring threats and calculating odds with the efficiency that came from a lifetime of survival in hostile territory. Children don't carry adult debts in any law I've ever heard of, he said with deadly calm, his voice cutting through Pete's bluster like a well-honed blade through paper. What you're describing sounds considerably more like slavery than legitimate business, and I believe that particular institution was settled by federal law some years back. The violence that followed was swift and brutal, erupting with the kind of explosive force that comes from years of pressure, finally finding release through the barrel of a gun. Pete's men moved to surround the wagon while he drew his pistol with practiced smoothness, but Hakan was already in motion, his warriors' training taking over with lethal efficiency. The Apache warriors' strikes were economical and devastating, each blow designed to disable rather than kill, but carrying enough force to drop grown men like sacks of grain. His movements flowed like water, like wind through pine trees, like all the natural forces that civilized men tried to control but never quite mastered. But 3 against 1 remained impossible odds, even for a man of his extraordinary skills, especially when those 3 were armed professionals who had been prepared for violence from the moment they rode up to the wagon. Pete's knife caught Hakan across the shoulder in a vicious slash, the blade parting leather and flesh with a sound like tearing silk. Pain blazed white-hot through his nervous system as blood began seeping through his shirt, but he managed to grab Hazel and the children before the gunfire erupted in deadly earnest. They ran through a hail of bullets toward the cottonwoods along Ghost Creek, lead striking stone and wood all around them, with sounds like deadly hail on a tin roof. Behind them, the wagon tilted crazily as one wheel finally gave way, completely under the stress, spilling their few remaining possessions across the dust in a mockery of the life they had been trying to preserve. Under the shelter of rustling leaves and dappled shade that seemed like paradise after the hell of open ground, Hakon's breathing came, in controlled gasps, while Hazel tore strips from her cotton petticoat to bind his wound. Her hands were steady despite the chaos they had just escaped years of frontier life, having taught her the basics of field medicine and emergency wound care. Copper Gulch law belongs to whoever has the most money and the most guns, Hakan said finally, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through any illusions she might have harbored about finding official justice through proper channels. Blackthorn owns the sheriff, the judge, and probably half the territorial legislature through direct payments or carefully applied pressure. Hazel felt her heart breaking as she thought about the future she had wanted to build for her children. A future of education and opportunity of choices, made freely rather than forced by desperate circumstances or the cruel whims of powerful men. Then we need proof of what really happened. Documentation that can't be bought or intimidated or destroyed in convenient fires. Hakan nodded despite the pain shooting through his shoulder, recognizing the steel in her voice that had first attracted him 10 years ago, during those 2 days when they had shared dreams and promises beneath the vast western sky. I know someone who might help us, someone honest. But the road to get there won't be safe or easy, and they'll be hunting us every step of the way. The journey that followed tested them all, in ways that went far beyond simple physical endurance. Blackthorn's men were relentless in their pursuit, attracting them with the professional skill of men who had hunted humans across hostile territory before. Dusty Bill and Quiet Will were no common thugs. They were experienced manhunters who understood their quarry's psychology and could read sign like Apache scouts. Their first narrow escape came at Beaver Creek Crossing, where the shallow water would have revealed their tracks to anyone following. Hakan spotted the glint of rifle barrels on the ridge above, just as Hazel was preparing to lead the children across. They spent 4 hours hiding in a dense thicket of willows, while the 2 gunmen searched both sides of the creek close enough that they could hear their voices discussing the best places to position themselves for clear killing shots. They went this way for certain. Dusty Bill's voice carried clearly across the water. I can see where the boy's small feet slipped in the mud, and there's blood on that rock where the Apache's shoulder brushed against it. Then where the hell are they now? Quiet Will's frustration was evident in his tone. They can't just disappear into thin air, and there's no cover between here and the next ridge. Felix pressed his face against Hazel's shoulder, his small body trembling with the effort of staying absolutely silent, while strange men discussed killing his family with the casual tone they might use to discuss the weather. Nora's eyes blazed with fierce concentration as she helped her mother keep her little brother quiet, her 10-year-old mind already understanding that their lives depended on not making a sound. Hakan's shoulder wound had reopened during their desperate flight, and Hazel could see fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage she had applied. The Apache warrior's face was gray with pain and blood loss, but his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings for threats and opportunities. Even wounded, he remained their best hope for survival against professional killers who knew this territory as well as they did. When the gunmen finally moved on, convinced their quarry had somehow circled back toward Willow Springs, the small party emerged from hiding, like ghosts materializing from the wilderness. But their relief was short-lived. Within hours, they could see dust clouds on the horizon that spoke of riders pushing their horses hard in pursuit. The second close call came at Devil's Canyon, where a narrow trail carved into the cliff face offered the only passage for miles in either direction. Hakan's tactical experience told him it was a perfect place for an ambush, but they had no choice. The alternative was a 50-mile detour that would give their pursuers time to summon reinforcements from Copper Gulch. They were halfway across the treacherous path when rifle shots began echoing off the canyon walls. Quiet Will had positioned himself on the opposite rim with a perfect view of the entire crossing, while Dusty Bill blocked their retreat from behind. Bullets chipped stone inches from their heads, sending razor-sharp fragments slicing through the air around them. "Move!" Hakan shouted, pushing Hazel and the children toward a narrow crevice in the rock face. While he returned fire with his Winchester, each shot carefully aimed to keep their attackers pinned down, rather than waste precious ammunition. "There's a cave behind those rocks. Get inside and stay down." The cave was barely large enough for 4 people, a natural shelter formed by fallen boulders that provided protection from rifle fire, but left them trapped with no way out except back onto the exposed trail. They huddled in the darkness for what felt like hours, listening to bullets ricocheting off stone and the shouted conversations of men discussing the best angles for killing shots. We can wait them out. Dusty Bill's voice echoed strangely in the confined space of the canyon. They got no water, no food, and nowhere to go. Come tomorrow morning, they'll be ready to deal or ready to die. Boss wants them alive if possible. Quiet Will replied. Says he's got questions that need answering before we finish this business properly. But Hakan had noticed something their pursuers had missed: a narrow crack in the back wall of their shelter that led to a series of natural tunnels through the rock. It would be a dangerous passage, especially with children. But it was their only chance of escape before thirst and exposure killed them more slowly than bullets. We go through the mountain, he whispered to Hazel, his voice barely audible even in the enclosed space. It's not safe, but it's better than waiting here to die or surrender. The underground journey was a nightmare of crawling through spaces barely wide enough for adult shoulders, of following air currents in absolute darkness, of trusting Hakan's wilderness instincts to guide them through a maze that could easily become their tomb. Felix whimpered quietly as they squeezed through passages that seemed to close around them like stone coffins, while Nora bit her lips so hard she drew blood, rather than give voice to her terror. They emerged 3 miles away, covered in rock dust and exhausted beyond measure, but alive and temporarily free from immediate pursuit. However, their relief was tempered by the knowledge that Blackthorn's men would quickly discover their escape route and resume the hunt with even greater determination. The night journey to Sable Junction became a desperate race against time and professional trackers who seemed to anticipate their every move. They traveled by moonlight through terrain that offered little concealment, always aware that trained killers were following their trail with methodical precision. Sable Junction's single hotel wore its prejudice like a badge of honor, the hand-painted sign making Hakon's exclusion both legal and absolute. No Indians, dogs, or drunks. By order of management and territorial law. The casual cruelty of the rejection struck Hazel like a physical blow, forcing her to confront privileges she had never thought to question during her years of relative security. We'll make do in the livery stable, she decided without hesitation, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that brooked no argument from anyone, including herself. All of us together like a proper family should be. The stable was warm and fragrant with hay and horse sweat, a humble sanctuary that welcomed them when the respectable establishment had turned them away, based on nothing more than the color of Hakan's skin. The horses nickered softly in their stalls, offering the kind of honest companionship that many humans seemed incapable of providing. Felix curled against his mother's side in the sweet-smelling hay, his exhausted body finally relaxing enough to allow sleep despite everything they had endured. Nora watched Hakan with curious, unafraid eyes that saw past skin color and cultural differences to the man who had risked everything to protect them from harm. Are you really an Apache warrior? She asked quietly, her 10-year-old directness cutting through the careful politeness that most adults use to avoid uncomfortable subjects. Hakan's weathered face softened as he looked at the brave little girl who had endured so much without complaint. I am Chiricahua Apache, he said simply. My people have lived in these mountains since the world was young. We fight when we must, but we prefer to live in peace when peace is possible. Mama says you saved her from a flood when she was young. Nora continued her child's curiosity, undiminished by the dangers they had faced. She says you were very brave and kind, and that she never forgot you. Your mother was very brave too. Hakan replied, his eyes finding Hazel's across the dim stable. Braver than she knew, and stronger than she believed. Those are good qualities to inherit. Dr. Edwin Harper arrived before dawn, with his medical bag, and the gentle manner of a man who had spent 30 years tending to the territory's forgotten and discarded citizens. His graying beard and wire-rimmed spectacles gave him the appearance of a scholar, but his hands bore the calluses and scars of someone who had delivered babies in sod houses and treated gunshot wounds in saloon back rooms. This shoulder needs proper cleaning and fresh stitching, he said after examining Hakan's wound by lamplight, his trained eye taking in the signs of infection that could prove fatal if left untreated. The bleeding has stopped, but I can see fragments of cloth embedded in the muscle tissue. If we don't clean this properly, you'll be dead within a week. He worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with carbolic acid that made Hakan's jaw clench against the burning pain, and then closing it with neat, precise stitches that would hold under stress. When the Apache warrior reached for his small leather purse to pay for the treatment, the doctor waved him away with genuine warmth. Any man who puts himself between armed killers and innocent children doesn't pay for medical treatment in my practice, he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made that policy and intended to stick to it, regardless of social pressure. That's been my rule for 20 years, and I'm far too old and stubborn to change it now. On the depot platform, as the morning train's whistle echoed across the empty prairie, like a mechanical rooster greeting the dawn, Miss Beatrice Lane approached them with the determined stride of a woman who had spent her entire adult life fighting battles that others preferred to ignore or pretend didn't exist. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes like chips of winter sky, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had discovered that knowledge was the most powerful weapon against ignorance and systematic oppression. Her traveling teaching position required her to cover 3 different communities on horseback, her saddlebags filled with books, and the kind of unshakable principles that had made her effective in places where most teachers failed. "You're Arthur Bennett's widow," she said, recognition dawning in her sharp gaze as she studied Hazel's face with the attention to detail that came from years of working with children who often communicated more through expression than words. He made specific promises about funding new textbooks and educational materials for my students. Books that would help these children build better futures than their parents had been able to achieve. Her expression hardened as she looked toward the distant glow of smelter fires, painting the horizon in shades of orange and red, the industrial flames that burned day and night in service to Victor Blackthorn's relentless pursuit of copper wealth. We never received those educational materials naturally, but we heard plenty of polite excuses from Mr. Blackthorn's well-dressed representatives, always delivered with perfect Eastern manners and complete finality. Beatrice stepped closer, lowering her voice to the kind of conspiratorial whisper that teachers used when sharing crucial information with particularly promising students who needed to understand the world's harsher realities. "There's something you need to understand about Victor Blackthorn's business methods. He's not just greedy in the simple way of most frontier profiteers. He's systematic and methodical in his approach to acquiring what he wants." She paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard by the wrong people before continuing. "Every fraud requires documentation for insurance purposes and legal protection. He keeps meticulous duplicate records of all transactions, contracts, and correspondence in his stamp mill office. The man is obsessive about maintaining paper trails that support his version of events." The information hit Hazel like cold water, suddenly expanding her understanding of Blackthorn's criminal enterprise beyond her personal tragedy to encompass a pattern of systematic exploitation that had probably destroyed dozens of families. "How many people has he cheated?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than anyone wants to count." Beatrice replied grimly, her educator's instinct for precise information serving them well in this deadly situation. "But perhaps fewer than he plans to destroy if someone doesn't find a way to stop him soon." The Henderson widow lost her farm last month under remarkably similar circumstances. The Kowalski family disappeared entirely after questioning their debt obligations too persistently. Before they could continue their conversation, the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats announced that their brief respite was over. Dusty Bill and Quiet Will had found their trail again, tracking them with the relentless efficiency of men who took professional pride in never losing their quarry. The chase that erupted through Sable Junction's railroad yard was a desperate affair of steam, and steel terror and determination played out against the backdrop of a civilization that ran on iron rails and coal fires. They ran between freight cars, while locomotive sparks showered around them like falling stars, the acrid smell of coal smoke mixing with the metallic tang of fear sweat and spilled blood. Hazel dragged Felix beneath a railroad coupling, while bullets chewed splinters from wooden car sides, each impact sounding like giant fists pounding against the walls of their temporary shelter. The boy's terrified sobbing was lost in the noise of the pursuing gunmen and the mechanical roar of the train engines. But his small hands clutched at his mother's dress with desperate intensity. Hakan, weakened by blood loss and the constant drain of pain from his reopened shoulder wound, grabbed a railroad worker's heavy iron bar and used it as a weapon when Quiet Will ventured too close to their position. The improvised club connected with the gunman's skull in a sound like splitting wood, sending him tumbling from his saddle with blood streaming from his scalp. His horse, a well-trained animal, unused to such violence, shied away from the chaos with rolling eyes and foam-flecked lips. The momentary confusion gave them the opening they needed to leap across a cattle guard and run through fields of purple lupine toward the Ash River bullets, chewing up railroad ties and sending sprays of gravel into the air behind them. The sound of pursuit followed them like thunder, made personal hoofbeats and shouted curses, providing a deadly percussion to their desperate flight toward water that might offer concealment or escape. Behind them, Dusty Bill was shouting orders to other men who seemed to be converging on their position from multiple directions. The Ash River ran high, with snowmelt from the distant mountains, its current icy and treacherous, even in the strengthening daylight. They forded just ahead of their pursuers, the shock of cold water driving the breath from their lungs and making their muscles seize with sudden cramping that threatened to drag them under. Felix slipped on the smooth river stones that were made treacherous by moss and swift current, his small form immediately caught by hungry water that threatened to sweep him downstream toward deeper pools and certain death. Without hesitation, Hakan dropped his precious Winchester rifle and lunged forward with his good arm to haul the boy back to safety, sacrificing his primary weapon to save a child's life. They reached the far bank, soaked and shivering, their clothes clinging to their bodies like second skins that seemed determined to drag them back into the killing current. The cost was immediate and devastating. Hakan had lost his long gun to the river's depths, his shoulder wound had reopened completely from the exertion, and they were now reduced to Hazel's partially loaded revolver and a small skinning knife that would be useless in any real fight. But they were alive, and in their current circumstances, that represented a kind of victory that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. Behind them, their pursuers were forced to find their own crossing point, buying precious time that might make the difference between capture and escape. Copper Gulch at sunset presented itself as a vision of industrial ambition painted in shades of sulfur and human misery. The smelter fires burned day and night without respite, sending columns of noxious fumes into the sky, while stamp mills thundered with the relentless rhythm of mechanical progress that measured success only in tons of ore processed and profits extracted. The town existed in a state of barely controlled chaos, where miners spent their wages as quickly as they earned them on whiskey and gambling, and women where violence simmered just beneath the surface of every conversation, like a pot perpetually on the verge of boiling over. Wooden sidewalks were slick with a fine coating of ore dust that turned to treacherous mud when mixed with spilled alcohol and human sweat. Blackthorn's influence was visible everywhere they looked, in the well-dressed men who watched from saloon doorways, with the cold eyes of professional enforcers, in the nervous glances that honest citizens exchanged when discussing their problems, in the way mothers hustled their children inside when certain carriages rolled down the main street with their curtains drawn and their occupants hidden. Hakan kept to the alleys and shadows, knowing that his Apache features would attract the wrong kind of attention from deputies who shot first and invented legal justifications afterward. But separation from Hazel and the children was impossible now they had become a unit forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. A family bound together by circumstances that transcended blood relations or legal documents. The territorial courthouse was actually the back room of Murphy's saloon, where justice was dispensed between poker games and whiskey sales by men who had never read a law book, but understood the practical applications of money and influence. Hazel found the justice of the peace-holding court at a green felt table cigar smoke hanging in the air like incense at a particularly corrupt altar. Judge Morrison barely looked up from his cards. As she made her case, his attention focused on the hand he was playing against Victor Blackthorne himself. The mine owner sat across from him with the relaxed confidence of a man who owned both the cards and the dealer, his expensive clothes and cultured manner making him look like visiting royalty in this frontier setting. Territorial mining law is quite specific about widows' rights in matters of property inheritance. The judge declared, without examining any of her carefully preserved documentation, a woman's signature carries no legal weight in matters of mineral claims or water rights. That's established precedent dating back to the original territorial charter. Blackthorne's smile was as cold as January moonlight on snow, his cultured voice dripping with false sympathy that didn't quite disguise the satisfaction underneath. "You're certainly welcome to appeal to the Territorial Supreme Court, my dear Mrs. Bennett. Justice is available to all citizens who can afford to pursue it through proper legal channels." He paused dramatically, studying his cards with the casual attention of a man who knew the game was fixed in his favor, before continuing. "Of course, the next session convenes in Santa Fe approximately 10 months from now, assuming the mountain passes remain clear and the Apache situation stays peaceful. Such are the inevitable challenges of frontier justice, I'm afraid." The message was abundantly clear. She could pursue legal remedies that would take years to resolve, while her children starved and her water rights were seized through more immediate and practical methods. Blackthorne held all the advantages of wealth, political influence, and time, a combination that had crushed countless families before hers, and would continue doing so long after her particular case was forgotten. But what he didn't know, what his arrogance and systematic cruelty had blinded him to, was that Hazel Bennett had something he had never possessed: the absolute determination of a mother protecting her children, and the partnership of a warrior who understood that some battles could only be won through direct action rather than legal maneuvering. The plan they developed that night in the schoolhouse cellar was born of desperation and necessity, refined through the kind of careful attention to detail that teachers and warriors both understood instinctively. Beatrice provided them with guard schedules copied from weeks of careful observation, her educator's habit of noting patterns and irregularities serving them in ways she had never intended when she first began paying attention to the mine's security arrangements. Blackthorne's private office is located on the second floor of the stamp mill building, she explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across the wooden table with the precision of someone accustomed to making complex information understandable to children. The guards change shifts at midnight and 4 in the morning. There's approximately a 15-minute window when the night watchman makes his rounds of the processing equipment and the office level is temporarily unguarded. Dr. Harper contributed medical supplies and a small hand drill that could be used to wedge doors shut behind them, his physician's bag supplemented with tools that spoke of grim preparation for the kinds of injuries that might result from their planned criminal activity. "If you're absolutely determined to do this dangerous thing," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the kind of concern that came from having treated too many victims of similar desperate plans, "at least take proper precautions to ensure you can get back out again." Hawkins studied the map with a warrior's eye for tactical advantage and potential disaster, his finger tracing possible routes of approach and escape, while his mind calculated the dozens of things that could go wrong with even the best planned operation. The drainage culvert runs directly beneath the building's foundation. We can approach completely unseen, but once we're inside, there's only one way out if something goes wrong. Hazel felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she contemplated what they were planning to do. Breaking into Blackthorne's office would make them criminals in the eyes of territorial law, but the alternative was watching her children's future stolen through legal theft and systematic corruption that would never be challenged through official channels. "We do this together," she said finally, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that had been forged in crisis and tempered by loss. "All the way to the end, whatever that looks like and wherever it leads us." At midnight on April 20th, when the stamp mills fell silent for their brief maintenance period and Copper Gulch settled into its uneasy sleep, they crawled through the storm drainage system like shadows given human form and deadly purpose. The tunnel was barely wide enough for adult shoulders filled with the sound of dripping water and the scurry of rats disturbed from their nests by this unusual invasion of their underground domain. The air in the drainage tunnel was thick and fetid heavy with the smell of industrial runoff and human waste that made every breath a conscious effort. They moved in single file, Hakan leading despite his injured shoulder, followed by Hazel, then Beatrice and Dr. Harper, bringing up the rear with their improvised tools and medical supplies. Inside Blackthorn's office, surrounded by the trappings of legitimate business and barely concealed criminality, Hazel's nerves stretched tight as piano wire. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, the creak of floorboards beneath her boots, the rustle of papers as she searched through filing cabinets, the distant snoring of a guard who might wake at the worst possible moment and raise an alarm that would bring armed men running. The office was decorated with expensive furnishings that spoke of wealth extracted from the labor of others, Persian rugs that cost more than most miners earned in a year, oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes that had nothing to do with the harsh realities of frontier life, and a massive oak desk that dominated the room like a throne from which Blackthorn dispensed his particular brand of industrial tyranny. Arthur's bent brass key felt warm in her sweating palm, and the metal worn smooth by his handling during the final weeks of his life, when he must have known that his time was running out. He had pressed it into her hands as he lay dying from injuries that no frontier doctor could repair, his voice barely a whisper, as he insisted she keep it safe for reasons he couldn't explain through blood-frothed lips. "It's not much to look at, darling." He had said, his breathing shallow and labored from internal damage that was slowly killing him. "But it might be the only thing standing between our children and complete disaster when the wolves come calling. Promise me you'll keep it hidden, Hazel. Promise me you'll use it when the time finally comes." Only now did she understand its true purpose. The key had been bent deliberately to disguise the fact that it was the only way to access Arthur's hidden insurance against Blackthorn's inevitable betrayal. A secret compartment in the mine office safe, where he had been secretly copying every document and transaction that passed through his hands as a trusted employee. The key turned with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silent room. Inside the safe's hidden drawer lay Arthur's personal ledger, meticulously maintained records of every fraudulent transaction, and a stack of forged promissory notes bearing Blackthorn's official stamp. But more damaging than any financial records was the correspondence that revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise letters discussing the deliberate elimination of witnesses' plans for expanding his operations through systematic intimidation and detailed instructions for making mining accidents appear convincingly accidental. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, accompanied by the sound of off-key whistling that indicated the night guard was making his rounds ahead of schedule. Hakan pulled Hazel under the heavy oak desk with swift efficiency, his hand firm but gentle as they pressed themselves against the wooden panel and tried to become invisible through sheer force of will. A guard entered the office, still whistling his tuneless melody, as he checked the window latches with mechanical thoroughness and then relieved himself into the alley below, apparently unconcerned about the dignity of his employer's private workspace. They held their breath until their lungs burned with the effort, every muscle frozen in place, until his footsteps finally faded down the hallway toward the next room on his rounds. When they finally crawled back through the drainage culvert with their stolen evidence, dawn was beginning to break over the eastern mountains. Hazel clutched papers that seemed to burn her fingers with their implications, documents that revealed not just the scope of Blackthorn's criminal activities, but the systematic nature of his operations and his complete lack of concern for human life when it interfered with profit. Among the most damaging evidence was correspondence with corrupt officials in the territorial government, detailed plans for eliminating inconvenient witnesses, and financial records that showed how mining accidents were deliberately arranged to eliminate employees who asked too many questions about safety conditions or wage discrepancies. But hidden in the ledger's back pages, folded small and sealed with red wax, was something that would prove even more significant than evidence of financial fraud. A letter addressed to Hakon, in Arthur's distinctive handwriting, placed there deliberately as a final insurance policy against Blackthorn's plans for Hazel and the children. However, this letter would remain hidden for now, its explosive contents waiting for the right moment to be revealed when they could have maximum impact on the deadly game they were all playing. Blackthorn's retaliation came with the calculated precision of a man who understood that the most effective pressure was applied through love rather than fear, through attacking what people valued most rather than what they could afford to lose. On the morning of April 22nd, while Hazel and Hakon were meeting with potential allies in the next town over, Greasy Pete struck with military efficiency that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of his target's routines. Nora was seized outside the schoolhouse during the morning recess period, her disappearance discovered only when the other children came running to Beatrice, with tears streaming down their faces and terror making their voices shake with emotion. The attack had been swift and professional, carried out in broad daylight, with the kind of brazen confidence that came from knowing local law enforcement would ask no inconvenient questions. They took her, Miss Lane. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison sobbed his words tumbling over each other in his desperate haste to get them out, before his voice failed completely. 3 men on horses, and they grabbed Nora right off the school steps. She tried to fight them, something fierce, but they were too strong and too many. The message Pete left was pinned to the schoolhouse door with a railroad spike driven deep into the wood and the metal point gleaming like a promise of violence that made everyone who saw it understand that this was no idle threat. The paper itself was expensive stationery bearing Blackthorn's official letterhead, as if the kidnapping were simply another business transaction requiring proper documentation. Mrs. Bennett, you have stolen property that belongs to me, and I want it returned immediately. Bring everything you took from my office to Ghost Creek Mine before the sun sets today, or your daughter will learn firsthand what happens to the children of thieves in my territory. No law enforcement, no rescue attempts, no tricks or clever schemes. Just you and my property delivered as requested. Don't disappoint me in this matter, as the consequences would be most unfortunate for all concerned. Victor Blackthorn, owner and operator Blackthorn, Consolidated Mining. When Hazel returned to find the note, she collapsed as if someone had cut the strings holding her upright, her legs giving way completely as the full horror of the situation crashed over her like a physical force. Her worst nightmare, her children threatened because of choices she had made in pursuit of justice, had become reality with brutal efficiency that left no room for denial or false hope. The sound that came from her throat was something between a sob and a howl. The cry of a mother whose heart was being torn from her chest by men who saw children as nothing more than leverage to be used in their criminal enterprises. Felix pressed against her side, his own fear temporarily forgotten in the face of his mother's anguish. I won't gamble with her life, she said through tears that seemed to come from the very center of her being, her voice flat with terrible certainty as she stared at the threatening message. Not for water rights, not for justice, not for anything in this world or the next. She's my baby, and I'll give them whatever they want if it means she comes home safe. Finn O'Rourke arrived within the hour, his wagon loaded with supplies that spoke of grim preparation and the kind of desperate determination that had carried Irish peasants through generations of conflict with oppressive landlords. He brought mining-fused black powder and a collection of tools that had been forged for construction, but could serve destruction just as effectively when circumstances demanded it. I've been expecting something like this, He said, his County Cork accent thicker than usual with emotion as he pressed supplies into their hands with the methodical efficiency of a man preparing for war. Blackthorn's the type who escalates when he feels cornered like a wounded animal backed into a cave with nowhere left to run. But if the bastard thinks he can threaten innocent children without facing consequences, then he's about to learn how wrong a man can be. His weathered hands were steady despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. Hands that had built farms from wilderness and raised children in a land that seemed determined to kill anyone who showed weakness. "But ye must promise me this Hazel Bennett bring that little Colleen home safe, whatever the cost to the rest of us. Some things are worth more than justice or revenge or anything else we might call noble." The assault on Ghost Creek Mine was planned with the desperate thoroughness of people who understood they would get only one chance to succeed before superior numbers and firepower overwhelmed them completely. The mine represented the heart of Blackthorn's operation, a network of tunnels that burrowed deep into the mountain's core, following copper veins that had made him wealthy and powerful enough to corrupt half the territorial government. But it was also a fortress defended by men who understood violence as a professional tool rather than a last resort. Dusty Bill had survived the river crossing and had been joined by additional gunmen recruited from the worst elements of the mining camps, hardened killers who would shoot children as readily as adults if the price was right. The first assault failed before it truly began, crushed by superior positioning and firepower that turned their desperate charge into a killing field. Finn tried to create a diversion by approaching from the east with his wagon loaded with explosive materials. But Quiet Will, who had also survived their previous encounters, spotted him moving through the scrub oak and opened fire without warning or mercy. The Irishman took a rifle bullet in the chest that sent him tumbling backward against his wagon, bright red arterial blood spreading across his work shirt like spilled paint in a grotesque parody of the roses his wife had loved to grow in their small garden. His eyes found Hazel's across the distance as she knelt beside him, in the dust, his life leaking out onto the unforgiving ground with each labored breath. "Don't ye let them take the children." He gasped, his accent thick with approaching death and the weight of everything he was leaving unfinished. "Promise me that, lass. Promise me on your own children's lives that ye won't let evil win this day, no matter what it costs." His hand found hers with surprising strength for a dying man. Calloused fingers squeezing tight as consciousness began to fade from his blue eyes. "Tell me, wife. Tell her I died trying to do right by innocent folks. Tell her I never forgot. Never forgot the sound of our little ones laughing in the garden she planted." Then he was gone, leaving behind a widow and children who would never fully understand why good men had to die for other people's greed, who would spend the rest of their lives asking questions that had no satisfactory answers. His sacrifice bought them precious seconds to retreat from the killing field. But Greasy Pete had used the confusion to escape with their stolen evidence, while Nora disappeared deeper into the mine's timbered depths. For the first time since this nightmare began, Hazel's faith in their mission wavered like a candle flame in a strong wind. They had lost their proof their strongest ally was dead, and her daughter remained in the hands of men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who opposed them. "Everything Arthur died to protect is gone," she said, staring at the mine entrance, as if she could will her daughter back to safety through maternal determination alone. "We have nothing left to bargain with. No way to prove Blackthorn's crimes, no leverage to force him to release Nora safely." Hakan met her eyes with the kind of quiet resolve that had carried Apache warriors through impossible odds for generations beyond counting. His shoulder was bleeding again from the stress of combat, and his face was gray with pain and exhaustion. But his voice remained steady as granite. "Then we stop trying to prove his crimes and start focusing on stopping the man who committed them," he said with deadly calm. Sometimes the best evidence is a confession extracted under the right kind of pressure. and sometimes justice has to be taken rather than waited for. The thunderstorm that lashed Ghost Creek that evening transformed the already dangerous landscape into something biblical in its fury and scope. Lightning split the sky in jagged displays that turned night into day for brief, terrifying moments, while thunder rolled down the mountainsides like the footsteps of angry gods demanding retribution for human sins. Rain fell in sheets that turned dust to treacherous mud and made every surface slippery with water that seemed to contain its own malevolent intent. The storm was the kind of weather that killed travelers who were caught in the open, that turned normally safe passages into death traps and reduced visibility to mere yards in any direction. The mine entrance yawned before them, like the mouth of hell itself, its timbered supports disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light and give nothing back but echoes of their own fears. This was where Nora was being held, somewhere in the maze of tunnels and chambers that had been carved from living rock by men who cared nothing for safety or human life. Hazel and Hakan prepared to descend into the depths, knowing they were walking into a trap, but seeing no alternative that didn't involve abandoning Nora to whatever fate Blackthorn had planned for a 10-year-old girl whose only crime was being born to parents who dared to oppose his will. They were joined by Dr. Harper, whose knowledge of mine layouts from treating countless accident victims made him invaluable despite his lack of combat experience. His medical bag had been supplemented with improvised weapons and tools that might prove useful in the kind of underground warfare they were about to face. Beatrice Lane also insisted on joining them, her teacher's determination overriding any concerns about personal safety when one of her students was in mortal danger. That child sits in my classroom every morning and trusts me to keep her safe, she declared with the kind of fierce protectiveness that had made her an effective educator in 3 different frontier communities. I don't intend to betray that trust now, regardless of the personal consequences. The mine was a labyrinth of interconnected tunnels and vertical shafts, horizontal drifts that branched like the roots of some massive underground tree that fed on copper ore and human suffering. The air was thick with dust and the metallic taste of fear, every sound echoing and re-echoing, until it became impossible to determine direction or distance with any accuracy. As they descended deeper into the mountain's bowels, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the darkness seemed to press against their lanterns like a living thing determined to extinguish any source of light or hope. The wooden support beams groaned under the weight of countless tons of rock and water, seeped through cracks in the stone to form treacherous pools that reflected their lantern flames like the eyes of subterranean demons. Deep in the mine's heart, Victor Blackthorn was implementing his final gambit with the methodical precision that had made him both wealthy and feared throughout the territory. He had decided that the evidence against him was too damaging to allow anyone to leave the mine alive, and a carefully planned accident would provide the perfect cover for eliminating multiple witnesses while collecting substantial insurance payments on his mining operation. Oil-soaked rags had been strategically placed throughout the tunnel system, ready to burst into flames that would spread through decades of accumulated debris with hungry enthusiasm. The mine would become a furnace drawing oxygen from the surface through natural ventilation, while turning every tunnel into a chimney that would consume everything in its path, evidence, witnesses, and inconvenient children alike. But Blackthorn's plan went beyond simple arson. He intended to toy with his victims first, using his intimate knowledge of the mine's layout to hunt them through the tunnels like animals, savoring their fear and desperation, before finally allowing them to die in the flames he would set when their usefulness as entertainment was exhausted. The first sign of his presence was the sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere ahead of them, accompanied by a cultured voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once due to the acoustic properties of the underground chambers. "Welcome to my domain, Mrs. Bennett." Blackthorn's voice carried clearly through the tunnels, amplified and distorted by the rock walls until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I do hope you've brought my stolen property with you, though I suspect we both know that compliance was never really your intention." They pressed forward through the maze, following the sound of his voice, while trying to avoid the obvious traps he had prepared for them. Several passages had been deliberately weakened so that the slightest disturbance would cause cave-ins, while others led to dead ends where armed men waited in ambush. "You really should have accepted my generous offer regarding your water rights." Blackthorn continued his voice, moving through the tunnels as he led them deeper into his carefully prepared killing ground. "It would have been so much simpler for everyone involved, and your children would have had the opportunity to grow up and live productive lives in service to my various enterprises." The psychological warfare was as carefully planned as the physical traps. By keeping them moving and uncertain, by forcing them to follow his voice through increasingly dangerous passages, he was wearing down their resolve and making them desperate enough to make the kinds of mistakes that would allow him to capture them without a fight. They found evidence of his preparations everywhere. Barricades that had been constructed to channel their movement in specific directions, oil-soaked timbers that would burst into flames at the touch of a match, and carefully positioned charges of black powder that could bring down entire sections of tunnel if triggered at the right moment. "I'm curious about something, Mrs. Bennett." Blackthorn's voice seemed closer now, coming from just around the next bend in the tunnel. "What exactly did you hope to accomplish with your amateur burglary? Did you really think that stealing my business records would somehow magically transform you into a threat worthy of my serious attention?" The smoke began as a thin haze that made their eyes water and their throats burn, but it thickened rapidly as fires caught and spread through the prepared combustible materials. The mine was becoming exactly what Blackthorn had planned, a furnace designed to consume anyone foolish enough to enter his domain without permission. Hawkins soaked his bandana in seepage water, while Hazel pulled Felix's shirt over her nose and mouth. But the smoke continued to thicken with each passing minute. Their lanterns became useless as visibility dropped to mere feet, and the heat began to build into levels that made every breath a conscious struggle against suffocation. "The beauty of my plan." Blackthorn's voice continued now, definitely coming from somewhere directly ahead of them, "is its elegant simplicity. A tragic mining accident claims the lives of several trespassers who were attempting to steal valuable ore samples. The insurance payments will more than compensate for any temporary disruptions to my operations." They pressed forward through the thickening smoke, guided now more by sound than sight, as the fires spread, and the heat became almost unbearable. Beatrice carried a water bucket that they refilled from underground streams, the liquid precious beyond gold, in this hellish environment that seemed designed to kill them through a dozen different methods. It was Dr. Harper who spotted the first body, Greasy Pete, lying motionless beside a pile of stolen documents that had been scattered across the tunnel floor. The man had apparently tried to escape through a side passage, only to be overcome by smoke before he could find his way to the surface. "Even my own men aren't immune to the dangers of unauthorized exploration." Blackthorn observed his voice now coming from multiple directions as he moved through connecting passages they hadn't yet discovered. "Though I suppose Mr. Pete's demise does eliminate one potential witness to our various business arrangements over the years." They gathered up what documents they could salvage from Pete's scattered collection, but most of the papers were already damaged by smoke and water to the point of being unreadable. Their proof of Blackthorn's crimes was literally going up in smoke around them, leaving them with nothing but their own testimony against a man who owned most of the territorial legal system. The tunnel began to branch into multiple passages, each one leading deeper into the mountain's heart, where the air was thicker and the dangers multiplied with every step. They had to make a choice about which direction to follow, knowing that the wrong decision could trap them in a dead end while the fires spread behind them. "I can hear you discussing your options." Blackthorn's voice seemed to come from above them, now suggesting that he was moving through upper levels of the mine that they hadn't yet discovered. "Allow me to simplify your decision-making process. The child is being held in the deepest chamber of this facility, approximately half a mile further into the mountain. You have perhaps 30 minutes before the fires reach that location and make rescue impossible. The race against time and flame became a nightmare of crawling through spaces barely wide enough for adult shoulders, of following air currents in smoke so thick they could barely see their own hands, of trusting Hakon's wilderness instincts to guide them through a maze that could easily become their tomb. Felix whimpered quietly as they squeezed through passages that seemed to close around them like stone coffins, while Nora's absence felt like a physical wound that grew more painful with each passing minute. They were moving deeper into the mountain, further from safety, toward a confrontation that would likely kill them all, whether they succeeded in finding her or not. The heat was becoming unbearable, making every breath feel like inhaling liquid fire when they finally heard it. The sound of a child crying somewhere ahead of them in the darkness. Nora's voice muffled but unmistakable, calling for her mother, with the kind of desperation that only comes from facing death alone. They found her in a timbered chamber, where the sound of rushing water mixed with the crackle of approaching flames and the ominous groaning of stressed support beams. She was tied to a wooden post, with her mouth-gagged tears cutting clean tracks through the coal dust on her cheeks, but her eyes blazed with the same fierce determination that Hazel recognized in her own mirror. Victor Blackthorne stood on an ore cart platform 20 feet away, holding a dynamite primer, with the casual familiarity of a man who had used explosives to solve personnel problems before. His gentleman's facade had finally cracked completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath years of carefully cultivated respectability and Eastern refinement. "How thoughtful of you to join us for the finale," he called, his cultured voice echoing strangely in the smoke-filled chamber. "I was beginning to worry you might miss the grand performance I've arranged for your entertainment." He gestured theatrically with a primer, his movements revealing the kind of theatrical training that had served him well in deceiving territorial officials and business partners. "One more step forward, and I'll bring this entire section down on our heads. The girl dies, you die, and I collect a very generous insurance settlement for a tragic mining accident that claimed several lives. It's elegant in its simplicity, don't you think?" Dr. Harper whispered urgently from behind his medical knowledge, serving them in unexpected ways as he analyzed the structural implications of Blackthorne's threat. "That charge is positioned to collapse the main support column. The resulting blast will flood this entire level from the underground river system. We'll all drown like rats in a trap if he follows through." The standoff stretched across long seconds while smoke continued to thicken around them, and the heat built to levels that made clear thinking almost impossible. Hazel's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a giant's fist as she looked at her daughter tied helpless 20 feet away, with a madman holding her life in his hands. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to rush forward to place her own body between Nora and whatever harm threatened, but rational thought held her back. One wrong move would trigger an explosion that would kill them all, while accomplishing nothing except satisfying Blackthorne's desire for a dramatic ending to his criminal career. "You don't need to hurt the child," Hakon said calmly, moving forward slowly with his hands visible and empty, his posture deliberately non-threatening as he closed the distance between himself and certain death. "Your quarrel is with us, not with her. Let her go and we'll discuss whatever terms you want to propose. My quarrel is with anyone who threatens my business interests." Blackthorne replied, his smile sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. "Children, adults, entire families, it makes no difference to me whatsoever. Obstacles are obstacles regardless of their age or apparent innocence." The smoke was getting thicker, making it difficult to see clearly across the chamber when Blackthorne made his fatal mistake. In his arrogance and desire to prolong their suffering, he began to explain his plans in the kind of detail that revealed just how completely he had lost touch with reality. "You see, the beauty of tonight's arrangement is that it solves multiple problems simultaneously." He continued, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the fires were spreading faster than he had calculated. "Not only do I eliminate several inconvenient witnesses, but I also collect substantial insurance payments that will allow me to expand my operations into more profitable territories. He was so focused on his monologue, so convinced of his own superiority and control over the situation, that he failed to notice Hakan moving closer with each sentence. The Apache warrior used Blackthorn's verbosity against him, closing the distance between them, while the man's attention was focused on his own voice rather than the tactical realities of their confrontation. The territorial authorities will conduct a brief investigation naturally. Blackthorn continued warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he had already won. But they'll find nothing more than the tragic remains of several trespassers who died attempting to steal valuable ore samples from my lawfully operated mining facility. It was at that moment, when Blackthorn's attention was completely focused on his own clever planning, that the crisis reached its climax in a way none of them had anticipated. The wooden post to which Nora was tied had been weakened by the heat and smoke, and it chose that moment to crack with a sound like a gunshot. Nora fell sideways, still bound, but no longer secured to the post, and in her desperation, she instinctively reached for the small leather cord around her neck, a cord that held a turquoise bead she had worn since infancy, without understanding its significance. Hakan saw the movement and reacted with desperate inspiration, pulling his own matching bead from his shirt pocket and holding it high where the firelight could catch its blue-green surface. The two stones were identical, carved with matching symbols that spoke of promises made and connections that transcended time and circumstance. "Rum," he called, his voice cutting through the smoke and chaos with desperate urgency. "Look at me. Look at what I'm holding." The 10-year-old girl's eyes widened with sudden recognition that went beyond mere surprise to encompass a deeper understanding of connections she had never fully grasped. Her mother had told her stories about the bead she wore, about how it had been a gift from someone very special, but she had never seen its twin until this moment. The revelation struck everyone in the chamber like a physical blow. Blackthorn's concentration wavered as he tried to process this apparent irrelevance, his finger hesitating on the detonator as confusion replaced his earlier confidence. In that moment of distraction, Hazel's maternal instincts overrode every other consideration. The sight of her daughter in mortal danger, combined with the sudden understanding of what the matching beads represented, unleashed a protective fury that had been building for 10 years. "Oh, that's her father," she screamed, her voice cutting through the smoke and flames with desperate intensity. "You're threatening his own daughter. She's his blood, his family, his child." The words hung in the superheated air, like a revelation from heaven itself, transforming the entire nature of their confrontation in the space of a single heartbeat. This was no longer just about water rights, or mining claims, or business disputes. This was about family, about the most primal bonds that connected human beings to each other. Hakan's face transformed as the full implications of Hazel's words sank into his consciousness. The child he had been trying to protect wasn't just an innocent victim. She was his daughter, his own flesh and blood, connected to him by bonds that went deeper than law or social convention. The protective rage that filled him in that moment was something beyond mere anger, beyond the controlled violence of a trained warrior. This was the fury of a father discovering his child in mortal danger, and it gave him strength that transcended his physical injuries and limitations. Blackthorn's moment of confusion cost him everything. While he struggled to understand the significance of what he had just heard, Hakan lunged forward with the speed of a striking snake, his hands closing around the primer plunger with desperate strength. The struggle that followed was brief, but incredibly violent. Two men fighting for control of a device that would determine whether everyone in the chamber lived or died. Blackthorn was no weakling, despite his Eastern refinement, and he fought with the savage desperation of a cornered animal who knew that capture meant the end of everything he had built. But Hakan was fighting for his daughter's life, and that gave him an advantage that couldn't be measured in terms of physical strength or tactical training. He managed to wrench the primer away from Blackthorn's grip and hurl it into a corner of the chamber where it exploded harmlessly against the stone wall. The blast was still devastating, bringing down sections of timber and sending shockwaves through the mine that caused multiple cave-ins throughout the tunnel system. Water burst from fractured pipes in liquid avalanches that flooded the chamber knee-deep with icy mountain runoff. But the main supports held, and they were all still alive. Blackthorn stumbled backward from the force of the explosion, his expensive clothes torn and his face blackened with smoke and debris. For the first time since this confrontation began, he looked like what he really was, a desperate criminal, whose elaborate schemes had finally collapsed around him. "You've destroyed everything," he screamed, his cultured facade completely abandoned now in favor of raw hysteria. 50 years of careful planning, 20 years of building this empire, all of it ruined by an Apache savage and his illiterate whore. The words were his final mistake. Hakan might have shown mercy to a defeated enemy, might have been content to leave justice to territorial authorities, but no one was allowed to speak of his family in such terms and continue breathing. The fight that followed was primitive and brutal, conducted in rising floodwater while flames licked closer and the mine groaned around them like a living thing in pain. Blackthorn fought with the desperate savagery of a man who had nothing left to lose. But he was facing a warrior whose daughter's life hung in the balance. Hakan's injured shoulder failed him at a crucial moment, old stitches tearing as Blackthorn's fist connected with damaged tissue. Pain blazed white-hot through his nervous system, threatening to drag him down into unconsciousness just when his family needed him most. But Hazel was there to take up the fight, grabbing a discarded mining tool and driving its pointed end into Blackthorn's ribs with all the fury of 10 years' worth of accumulated injustice. The mine owner screamed and fell backward, crashing through a rotten section of catwalk to land in the rising water below, while Hakan struggled to maintain consciousness and Hazel worked frantically to free Nora from her bonds. Beatrice dove into the floodwater to retrieve what documents she could salvage from the scattered evidence. Her teacher's instincts overrode personal safety as she snatched crucial papers from the current before they could be swept away forever. As the water continued to rise and the flames spread closer to their position, they faced the moment that would define them all as human beings. Blackthorn was struggling in the flood below them, his legs caught in debris while the water rose toward his chest with each passing second. It would have been easy to leave him there to let the mountain claim one more victim of its own justice and extract payment for all the lives he had destroyed in pursuit of wealth and power. But Hazel looked at her daughter, at Hakon's daughter, and understood that the kind of people they chose to be in this moment would shape the kind of world she inherited. "We bring him up," she decided, her voice cutting through the water's roar with maternal authority that brooked no argument. "We do this right, or we become no better than he is. Our daughter deserves better examples than that." Together, she and Hakan hauled their enemy from the rising water, their muscles straining against his dead weight as debris swept past them in the current. The effort nearly killed them all when a broken ore platform came crashing downstream. But they managed to pull Blackthorn to safety while maintaining their own grip on the precarious footing. The climb toward daylight was a nightmare of smoke and flame, of collapsing tunnels and rising water that seemed determined to claim them all before they could reach the surface. Hakan's leg gave out completely when falling timber struck his already injured limb, and he had to be supported by Dr. Harper and Beatrice, while Hazel carried both children toward safety. But they made it emerging from the mine's entrance as the sun was rising over the eastern mountains to paint the sky in shades of gold and promise. Behind them, the Ghost Creek mine continued to burn and flood, but they carried with them the evidence needed to expose Blackthorn's crimes and the testimony of witnesses who had survived his attempt to silence them forever. More importantly, they carried something else, the knowledge that families could be formed through choice and sacrifice, as well as blood that love could transcend cultural boundaries and social conventions, and that justice was possible even in a world that seemed designed to reward the wicked and punish the innocent. The sun was climbing toward noon on April 25th When Circuit Judge Harrison Maxwell rode into Copper Gulch, with a full complement of territorial marshals summoned by urgent telegrams that had described crimes serious enough to warrant immediate judicial intervention. His arrival transformed the saloon courthouse into something resembling actual legal proceedings conducted according to territorial law rather than local corruption. The trial that followed was unlike anything the frontier town had ever witnessed, a careful presentation of evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud, intimidation, and murder carried out over a period of years. Dr. Harper testified first, his medical expertise lending credibility to technical details about mining safety, deliberate structural weakening, and the calculated nature of accidents that had claimed too many lives to be coincidental. His quiet dignity and professional vocabulary made even skeptical jury members lean forward to catch every word as he described the specific ways that safety equipment had been sabotaged and warning systems had been disabled to create the conditions for profitable accidents. Beatrice Lane followed with her teacher's precision, presenting the water-damaged but still legible documents they had rescued from the mine, with explanations that made complex financial fraud understandable to ordinary citizens. Her attention to detail and systematic approach to organizing evidence revealed patterns of forgery and embezzlement that even untrained observers could recognize. The courtroom was packed with miners and their families, people who had suffered under Blackthorn's system but had never dared to speak out individually. Now hearing their experiences validated by official testimony and documented evidence, they began to find their voices and add their own accounts to the growing catalog of abuse and exploitation. Greasy Pete had survived his smoke inhalation and was facing his own criminal charges, but his testimony proved valuable in establishing the scope of Blackthorn's criminal organization. His confession detailed years of intimidation, violence, and systematic corruption, and that extended far beyond simple business disputes into the realm of organized crime that had infected the entire territorial government. "He made us do it all." Pete mumbled his words slurred by pain and the knowledge that cooperation was his only hope for avoiding a hangman's noose. Said if we didn't keep the miners and farmers quiet, he'd find men who would. Said dead folks don't file complaints with territorial authorities, and live ones who talk too much tend to have mining accidents. But it was the presentation of Arthur's letter that provided the emotional and legal climax of the proceedings. Hidden among the documents Beatrice had salvaged from the flood, the letter had been discovered by Dr. Harper while organizing evidence for the trial. Its contents provided not just proof of Blackthorn's criminal methods, but also the missing piece of Hazel and Hakon's family puzzle. Judge Maxwell read the letter aloud to the packed courtroom, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky air. As Arthur Bennett's final testimony was heard by friends and neighbors who had known him as an honest working man, to whom it may concern. If this letter is being read, then I am likely dead, and my family is in danger from Victor Blackthorn and his criminal associates. I write this as insurance against his threats and as testimony to the truth that I have been forced to conceal for 10 years. In 1869, my wife Hazel was saved from floodwaters by an Apache warrior named Hakon of the Chiricahua Band. They spent 2 days together, waiting for the waters to recede, and she discovered afterward that she was carrying his child. I married her quickly to protect her from social consequences and raised the girl as my own daughter because I loved them both enough to claim them as family. Nora is Hakon's biological daughter, born of that brief encounter, and she deserves to know her true father if circumstances allow. Blackthorn has forced me to sign away our water rights by threatening to harm Hazel and the children if I refuse. He has men throughout the territory, and he has made it clear that my family's safety depends on my cooperation with his fraudulent schemes. If something happens to me, I pray that Hakon will find them and provide the protection I can no longer offer. The turquoise beads will serve as proof of their connection. I have seen the one Hazel keeps, and I know there is a matching stone that bears his name. May God forgive me for the deception, and may he protect my family from the evil I have tried to shield them from. Arthur Bennett, witnessed by Father Laurence, Mission San Miguel, April 10, 1879. The silence that followed the reading was broken by Nora herself, who stood up in the courtroom with the fearless determination of a child who had inherited courage from both sides of her family tree. "He's my father," she said, simply pointing to Hakan with absolute certainty. "I always knew there was something special about my bead, and now I understand what it means. Mama told me stories about the man who saved her, but I never knew he was my papa until he came to save us too." Judge Maxwell was visibly moved by the child's testimony and the evidence that supported it. The matching turquoise beads were presented as exhibits, their identical carving and symbolic meaning explained by Father Laurent, who had written from his mission to provide additional testimony about Arthur's character and the circumstances surrounding Nora's birth. This court finds that the evidence clearly establishes paternity. Judge Maxwell declared his gavel, striking the makeshift bench with authority that echoed through the crowded saloon. Hakan of the Chiricahua Apache is hereby recognized as the biological father of Nora Bennett and granted full parental rights alongside Mrs. Hazel Bennett as co-guardian of both children. The legal precedent was unprecedented in a territory where racial mixing was often punished rather than acknowledged, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the community support was clear. The gallery erupted in cheers from miners and farmers who had found their voice through the courage of this unlikely family. Victor Blackthorne was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison for fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder, with additional charges pending in federal court for his systematic corruption of government officials. His mining operations were seized by the territorial government and placed in trust to compensate his victims with special provisions made for the families of men who had died in suspicious accidents. The transformation of Copper Gulch began immediately, as new management implemented safety procedures and fair wage practices that turned the mining camp into something resembling a legitimate community. Miners who had lived in fear for years began to organize for better working conditions, supported by territorial authorities who were finally free from Blackthorne's corrupting influence. 3 weeks later, as spring settled over the Willow Springs Valley, with promises of green grass and flowing water that would actually reach the farmers who needed it, Hazel stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching her children play in irrigation channels that now carried clear mountain water to fields that would feed them for years to come. Hakan sat nearby, his legs still splinted but healing well under Dr. Harper's continued care, his presence having become as natural as sunrise in their daily routine. His quiet strength provided the stability their family needed to grow into something permanent and beautiful, a foundation built on sacrifice and love rather than mere legal documents. "Tell us about Owl Canyon again," Nora said, settling beside him with the comfortable intimacy of a daughter who had finally learned the complete truth about her origins. "Tell us about the flood and the stars and the promises you made to each other." Felix curled against his mother's side, his 6-year-old mind still processing the complex story of how their family had been forged through loss and discovery, through violence and healing, that had brought them together in ways that transcended simple blood relationships. Hakan's weathered face softened as he began the story they all knew by heart. Now how he had pulled a young woman from drowning waters, how they had spent 2 days and nights sharing dreams beneath an endless sky, how promises made in darkness had finally found their way to light through 10 years of separation and struggle. "Your mother was the bravest person I had ever met," he said, his voice carrying across the years to that younger version of himself who had carved her name into a turquoise bead with the tip of his knife. "She dreamed of children who would be free to choose their own paths, free to love without fear, free to build bridges between worlds that had been kept apart for too long." The evening was settling into darkness when the whole family walked together to the irrigation gate that had become the symbol of everything they had built through their courage and determination. The turquoise beads hung there on their braided leather cord, catching starlight and holding it like captured promises, finally fulfilled after a decade of separation. We did something that seemed impossible. Hazel set her hand finding Hawkins in the darkness, while her children played in the flowing water that represented their secure future. We took broken pieces and made them into something whole. We took hatred and fear and turned them into love and hope that will last for generations. Hakon's fingers intertwined with hers, calloused from years of warrior training, but gentle in their touch, representing the bridge between worlds that their children would inherit and build upon. Apache wisdom says that the strongest trees grow where different streams come together. Our children will grow strong because they carry the best of both worlds in their hearts. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the water, mixing with the murmur of irrigation channels that carried life to fields that had once been barren. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate, and the sound was answered from the cottonwoods along Ghost Creek, where they had first found shelter from their enemies. This was their ending, not dramatic or earth-shaking, but profound in its simple humanity. Two people who had found each other across impossible odds, who had built a family from the wreckage of loss and betrayal, who had proven that love could triumph over hatred when supported by courage, community, and the unwavering determination to protect what mattered most. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to promises kept, and new ones made to children who would inherit a world slightly better than the one their parents had found. In the cabin behind them, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming through curtained windows, calling them home to the life they had fought so hard to protect and build. Victor Blackthorne served 12 years in territorial prison before dying of consumption, his empire completely dismantled, and his victims finally compensated for their losses. The honest people of Copper Gulch built a community worth defending their children, inheriting not just land and property, but principles that made justice possible even on the frontier. And in the valley where Willow Springs ran clear and strong, a family that had been forged in fire and flood continued to grow and prosper, their love becoming the foundation for generations yet to come, who would carry their story forward into a future bright with possibility.